Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Thank you, Nigel, for that introduction. My name is Lord Kamall. I am a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University, also what's my title here? I can't remember, Honorary Fellow here at the Vincent Centre, where I help on the educational programme, particularly in partnership with the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. And one of the things that when I came to start working at Vincent Centre, we wanted to sort of reboost the entrepreneurial work that was done that Nigel had been doing for many years here. And in some ways, we are ourselves being entrepreneurial. So we've launched this series where we would invite entrepreneurs of different kinds, of different types. So for example, we have Mario Peters with us tonight. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we've also got people who have set up their own number of social enterprises, people who have set up campaign organisations. We have someone who mentors and gives loans to entrepreneurs from financially challenged communities. We also have someone who's an entrepreneur but also a mentor. So we want the sort of whole range of, to speak to a whole range of people. So delighted to have our first guest, Mario Peters. Rather have people long introduction, I think it's better we start off with a question about Mario. What was that moment that you realised that you were going to be an entrepreneur, or said, I want to start a business, I'm going to start a venture here? And as part of answering that, you can tell us a bit about yourself and that journey that led you to that point.
Yes, thank you, and welcome everybody. Well, I think there wasn't a particular moment. Looking back in the rearview mirror, I haven't had really a strategic plan at any point, so I can't pinpoint. I think the honest answer to that is it was a series of sort of nudges and serendipitous little exchanges. I can remember one thing actually. I had a really good job. I was working as a researcher in the physics department at the University of Oxford. So it wasn't like I was really I wasn't sitting in a basement somewhere conceiving of how I might make a living. And I had lots of job offers from aerospace companies in the US.
You were a rocket scientist, weren't you?
I was. So my background was.
We can't make that.
Yeah, I was a rocket. So my doctorate was developing cryogenic systems for space applications. And what that means is cooling things in space. You might have thought space is cold enough, but apparently you need to cool. So if any of you are really interested in that, and you don't want me to stop talking, catch me afterwards. But I think what actually happened was an interesting little anecdote on that, which is I was generally quite late. I'm generally not the first person in the office in the morning, but I'm often the last one. I'm a bit of a night owl. So on a Friday night on payday, I was in the physics department, which was in Oxford. And when I went to my pigeonhole, there was only one payslip left in a brown envelope under the P Peters, under the P pigeonholes. So I went, asked my payslip, took it home, and I pulled it open on a Saturday morning, and there, rather shockingly, it wasn't my payslip, it was my boss's payslip. Whose surname was also P, and he must have taken one. So I went, oh, that's embarrassing, I've opened it now, how am I going to explain that? But the significance of that was that his pay slip was only about 20% more than mine, and I was a junior research fellow, and he was 58 years old, very experienced.
Good age, by the way.
And so, I'm older than that now. So, and I actually kind of did a little bit of a double take, went, actually, well, this is, how am I gonna, and my brain started going. So probably in that moment was seeded the idea of, I don't think I can, and Oxford's a really expensive city, I don't think I can create the quality of life that I want for my children if I'm going to be earning that much when I'm 58 years old. So that was probably the first moment I thought, well, I need to think about something else.
And then tell me about that moment happened or occurred. What was your first step to actually be an entrepreneur? What was your first business idea? What was your first venture? Did it fail? Or was it successful? Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
That's a really good question. My very first action was to go and talk to someone that I knew was entrepreneurial. Name drop, his name is Ish. He now works for NASA in the UK, in the USA. And I knew to be very entrepreneurial. And we generally, academics share a big office. We call it the Goldfish Bowl, because it was right, everyone could see into it. And so we were in there, and I said, I've just opened this pay slip. So I went to this chap, Ish, and I said, I don't know what to do, that's really freaked me out. Anyway, he said, so the answer to your question was, I went and spoke to someone that I felt might be able to have something to offer. I will tell you very briefly the story of how this whole thing, he actually then said, here's what you do, Mario. And he pulled out 2 business cards and he said, go and see this chap. He runs a tutorial college in Oxford, and with a PhD from Oxford in physics, you can walk in, you can demand as much as you want. He said, ask that chap for all the maths and physics tutoring that he can offer you, and for 3 months. And then he said, go and see this chap, no, and this is my mortgage broker. And once you've got a 3-month income history, this other chap will lend you 4 times your combined salary, which was effectively 8 times my actual academic salary. I went, whoa, this isn't how I thought. I was just a research academic. So this chap was so entrepreneurial. I did exactly what he said. I went and tutored all of these young people. And being an academic, you haven't got a boss in academia, right? You could just do it like. So I had these people rocking up all day. I did my research at night, and these people came to me 3 months, and I went to the other chap. But during that process, I became really, really addicted to teaching those young kids. And I realized, and this is no false modesty, that I was a pretty mediocre rocket scientist and I was never really going to make much impact. But I felt I had something I really was on fire. I was looking forward to those young people coming through the door. All night, I wasn't so much thinking about my research, but how I would present gravity to my A-level student. So at the end of the thing, it all unfolded perfectly. The chap lent me the money. I bought a nice house with a garden in Oxford. But the seed was planted that I'm much better at working with young people than I am with academics.
So you find that you're a good tutor and you feel comfortable doing it, you enjoy it. Where did you then leap from doing it for other people to, I think your business was around tutoring, wasn't it? And tell us if I'm going in the right direction. How did you go from being a tutor for 3 months or whenever to actually turn it into a business opportunity?
Well, that's another really good question. I mean, I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I call them guardian angels. Have you ever had someone that's just gravitated into your orbit, drifted into your life, maybe for a short period of time, and just given you a little nudge, and then often they disappear again? Have you, some of you had that experience? And they've just nudged you, they've just given you that nugget of advice, or it can just be a throwaway conversation that just somehow lands in a certain way. And what happened for me was the chap that was giving me the chap that ran the tutorial college, he said to me, just completely off the cuff, one Easter, he said, why don't you run an Easter? Because I was getting really good reviews from my students, because I loved teaching them, He said, why don't you run an Easter revision course? And I said, what's an Easter revision course? And he said, well, Oxford's full of them. Every private tutor was running Easter revision. At the time, you had these 2-year terminal A-levels. There was no AS levels. You had to do everything back like now, So there was a huge market for young people who hadn't quite put in the effort to cram at the last minute to get into uni. So he said to me, this particular agency I work for didn't run one of these. So he just said, why don't you run one of these? So I went, well, how would I do that? Anyway, I did that with a bunch of pals. So I taught maths and physics. I went to a pal who was a PhD in biology and chemistry. And so the 2 of us set up an Easter revision course, and we rented one of the colleges at Oxford. And I think about 20 kids showed up. And I don't know how. I put a postage stamp size advert in the Telegraph and in the Times, and it cost me an awful lot of money. That's the only way to advertise. It cost me hundreds of pounds, which on an academic salary was quite a punt.
So that's a really interesting point. What made you think or know that you wanted to get your customers, as it were, via the Telegraph and via the Times?
That's a really good question. I'm not going to be able to answer some of them because they were back in the midst of time. But again, I kind of knew what I didn't know. I was very willing to be rather ignorant. Yeah. So I would ask anybody, and this is, if later on we're talking about what are the hallmarks of success for me personally, and this isn't necessarily transferable, it has been consult extensively. Just ask everybody, but then do it your way. It's not like I do what anyone tells me to, but I want to hear what you've all got to say, and then I will plough my own furrow.
And did someone say to you, go to the Times and Telegraph?
Somebody said to me, where would you get the kids? he said, well, that's where I would look. And I currently didn't read those broadsheets. I couldn't read them. So I went, okay. So I picked up the phone and put an advert in that big for hundreds of pounds. I kid you not how much those adverts were. And I got maybe 5 or 6 of kids, and then the next thing it's 20, and the 2 of us smashed it out of the park.
And you say that it was a lot of money for you at that time.
Yeah.
That sounds to me like you taking a risk. Did you see it as a risk at that time?
Very much so. Very much so, yes. This was 97, and I had children. I'd really just finished my PhD, my DPhil, and it was a big risk, really big risk. I remember writing a cheque and thinking, this is no guarantee I might get nothing for this. I don't even know if I told my wife I'd done that. It's like one of those risks that you kind of keep under, So yes, I do remember it being hundreds of pounds, and I thought, well, this is for that size advert.
And did you think about the downside, or did you think I'm just going to go for this and I can live with the downside, as it were? I mean, the reason I ask you this is because whatever one thinks of Donald Trump, in his book The Art of the Deal, he often says to people, in his book he says, when I'm making a decision, I think, what's the worst case scenario? Can I live with the worst case scenario? If I can, I go ahead. Was that sort of the process that you went through? I'm not saying that you...
Do you know what, that's a fundamental question around risk and on entrepreneurs. Absolutely fun. If you want to ask, if there was one theme you would teach, it would be about risk in your relationship to it. Because there's this thing called loss aversion that you've probably all heard of, which is essentially humans tend to fear loss twice as much as they value gaining something. So think of 100 quid. How much would you risk to gain 100 quid? But if you don't want to live, So we're hardwired for that for good evolutionary reasons. So there's a way to game that, which is critical for an entrepreneur. You might not have to game it if you're wired a certain way, which I was very luckily. But the way to game it is to really not overvalue what you've got, not be too attached in a Buddhist sense. So if you're naturally, I was never attached to stuff. Money was always quite easy for me since I was young. I was going to earn money, but I never cared too much about it. So for me, the loss aversion principle, the risk of losing stuff, didn't have such a grip on me. So the risk of no return, and I actually had a very good example of someone right close to me who was in a similar situation who couldn't stomach the risk. And what's the point? It's only a few hundred quid. And so for me, that is critical. If we were to teach on something on a course like ours we used to run, that relationship to risk is a really important one. And it's quite fundamental. I think there's a baseline, a bit like happiness, which one tends to revert to.
I'm in politics, and one of the things I often tell young politicians or budding politicians, one of the many bits of advice I give them is make sure your partner understands the journey, because I've seen too many relationships break up in politics because one partner will say, this isn't what I signed up for. And and that destroys your home life, and it could destroy your professional life as well. You said there about you didn't tell your wife. Were you thinking at the back of my mind, if this goes down badly, what will I tell my wife? Or actually she'll cope with it?
These are incredibly insightful questions, by the way.
I'm not trying to. I'm not doing relationship counselling.
So have you got a horizontal couch somewhere now? That's a really good question, Si, because in actual fact, had I continued in that vein of sort of shouldering the risk on mine, I don't think A, I would have succeeded in business, and B, my marriage would have survived, which it has, 35 years or something. So I had to, and it's a difficult thing to do, but I did start articulating what I was going through, including when I got things wrong. So I never did that thing. I've just lost X, and having to take that, because it's bad enough making a mistake. Although I don't believe in any such thing as mistake. I think there are no accidents. They're all just learning experiences. But I think having that additional burden of covert and concealment is a breaking point for me. So I did develop the courage to share. And actually, my wife then became an incredible ally in my businesses.
That's really important, I think, and personally in politics as well. And also when I was self-employed, that was very important. I was once made redundant, and I took the money and we worked out how long I could live on that money by cutting out all the other. My wife had previously done accountancy, so we went through my income and outgoings, cut stuff down, and I was able to go for a year before I could get my first income. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if my wife had not been supportive of me. So we're up to the space where someone's giving you the idea, go and do a tutorial, an A-level course, a week.
Short course.
But are you at that point? Are you still Mario Peters, but not actually? You haven't got a company yet. You're a sole trader. How did you think about? How did you go from there to incorporate it or set up a company?
This kind of fills me with lots of sort of rich memories, actually, because these times are really difficult for young kids. But actually, in hindsight, they're so rich, and the risk is part of it. So what happened was, I had no real intention of bailing out from a really good academic job. It was just a supplementary income. But then I got families that, by this, let's say year 2 and year 3, went from 20 kids to 80 kids. And by this time I had all my mates who were all Oxford PhDs teaching their subject. And we were really good at it because we weren't jaded high school teachers who were phoning it in. We loved our subject. We knew it really well. And this was a real gas for us. Yeah. Right? In the Easter holidays, a week or two, hang out. And this was the Wild West. This was before any regulation. Yeah. We were out there going to the pub with them every night till 11 o'clock at night. But their parents, we were sending these young people home, and the number of times that parents said, "What have you done to my fill in the blank?" They're absolutely on fire. And very often they said, "Is there any chance that little fill in the blank can come and stay with you from Easter to finish their A-levels?" Because they are absolutely. And we said, "No, we've all got day jobs. We can't do this." But eventually, there was enough people that I probably wouldn't have had the idea. But again, another guardian angel situation. I had this brewing idea that, maybe, I could. And one Easter holiday, I made more money in 2 weeks than my whole salary, right? So, which wasn't a massive amount. In today's figures, it might have been 50-something grand, it's fairly junior academic. Yeah. And I went, okay, so this is interesting. And I'm not particularly good at my day job, right? As I said, no false modesty around that. So I'm thinking, well, the writing's on the wall here. I'm good at this. And there was a lot of pressure for me to go to the next level and incorporate a company and actually set up a full-time offering.
Can we just roll back a little bit? Some of the parents said to you, "Can we send our children to you?"
Yeah.
That would scare the hell out of me, frankly.
Yeah.
What did that mean? Did you have to give them accommodation? Did you have to sort all that out? What was the offer then?
We actually did it for a year or two. I didn't go the whole. We actually, because Oxford at the time was full of like these landladies. Mrs. Hall was a famous one. They'd have a room and a bath under a cupboard, and so there was a whole lot of private landladies in Oxford. So after enough parents, and it was usually mums, badgered me. I went, well, I can have a look at it, but I'm not giving up my day job. You'd have to come to me. So we did exactly what we phoned around, and we had 5 or 6 landladies, and we said, this isn't going to be like school. They're going to have to be working on their own, and they come see us a few times a week. So that worked. Those kids all did amazingly well, and went off to university. One's a helicopter pilot, So it wasn't a massive leap of faith, because I'd done a year of these kids and they'd all gone on to really good university courses. So, all right, so we actually have seen the whole thing now. Mm. And that was the point where another guardian angel swung into my orbit. And that was an old school friend of mine who'd been off, worked in Indonesia, worked for a British guy, worked for banks out there. He was a stockbroker when we were at university. And he came back with a lot of money. He'd just ridden that wave. And he was really bored. He said, "What have you got anything for me?" I went, "Well, what do you do? Finance." Well, I know nothing about finance. But then I went to him and I said, "Look, I have got this brewing idea of setting up an actual school, and I've seen that I can do all the bits of it, and I'm pretty good at it. So if you wanted to, if we want to do something together." So because he was there alongside me, and he said, so naive, I said, "I think it'll take me 30 grand to set this up," which was the most ridiculous, naive estimation, because it took us about 250 grand. But had I thought it would cost 250, I never would have taken a leap of faith. It was just like, let's just do it. He put 30 grand, and he got half of the company for 30 grand. But by the end of the year, we each spent 150 grand, So he came along and just nudged me at the right time. So it was a series of little nudges and serendipitous meetings, and so there was no master plan. It just flowed.
So you incorporate.
Yeah.
And you and you said you set up a school. Tell us, what was that school? Was it a full-time school? Was it just a crammer for A levels? And what period did you have this? What was your offer to the world, as it were, or to the market?
Yeah, well, this was the first real knock that I had, and of many, and they're the making of you, aren't they? The knocks. So the first thing was happened that the chap that I was tutoring for, that agency, all the way back to those short courses, was a lovely old man called Edward Green, and he was the originator of the private tutorial college sector. In 1965, he set up the first, at Wadham College, the first concept of tutoring, and then it was for Oxbridge. It was in the 7th term. They'd come in and they'd see this chap, and they'd queue up his staircase. So he kind of spawned and invented the tutorial college. And this was his college that I was then tutoring for. He wanted to retire, and he was, I need to get this right, but he was very devout Presbyterian. And he knew by this time that I've been working for 3 or 4 years that I had very high moral principles. So, or at least in his judgment, I did. I managed to convince him I did. So he said to me, I want you to take over my school. Wow. And I kind of said, okay. And I got my business partner in, and we worked him in. And he actually had a cheque for £25,000 on just as a start. Anyway, so we then started recruiting.
So can I just double check? Did he sell it to you?
He was going to sell me his school,
right?
Which is called Edward Green's Tutorial Establishment.
Right.
It's still there now, called Green's Tutorial College, run by a friend of mine. But the first kick in the teeth was, and he was a really lovely old man. He wasn't very well, so he was going to retire. And he was in hospital, and he phoned me. He said, "You've got to come and see me." And I kind of knew what he was going to say. And he said, and by this time, by the way, I had started recruiting students for me owning that school in the building. So this is where we're going to do this. And so I had, a dozen students signed up, lots of, for A-level. And he called me into his hospital there, the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. He said, "Mary, this is the conversation you were hoping it wasn't going to happen. I can't sell you, I can't pull out. I'm going to pull out." And I went, "Okay, well, that's fine," because he just couldn't, from where he was in his hospital, but he couldn't let it go. Yeah. There was no hard feelings, but in the end, he went back in, and he lost it in a couple of years. However, in that moment, it was that first, oh my goodness, what are we going to do here? I've got several people signed up with deposits paid. I've got the bones of a really good business here, but no premises. And so the first thing I did, well, what would I call this thing? So I looked it up, and the internet was just about there. Mm-hmm. And I Googled somehow Oxford International College, and blow me down, the domain name existed and the company name existed. Well, I'll have those two. Yeah. So I thought, and so that pivoted me. Now, Green's Tutorial Establishment was a very British, all Eton. He was an old Etonian. It was all that. So in forcing into the international, it was the only word I could get with Oxford College, Oxford International College. It kind of nudged me towards, well, I'm going to have to recruit international students now. So, and within a year, we were outperforming Edward's company, bless him, rest his soul. And within 2 years, we had amazing A-level results because my model was still having really great tutors who weren't teachers. They were very good at their subject. And we pulled them out of academia, and the ones that really like to be with young people, and we tutored these kids in our spare time. It's not a level playing field with all those hard-working school teachers who work really hard. It's not a level playing field if you're coming out of a lab teaching for an hour. So that's where I'm at.
And so you started the business. You've got your students. It grows. What did it grow to when you sold it? As it were?
So
and tell us a bit about that journey.
Yeah, well, the proposition was, at this point, we're saying, well, I know what I'm doing. Mostly British kids at this point. Now we're pivoting to international kids, largely because the name demands that we do so. And I thought, well, what's our USP? In a pretty saturated market. Oxford had a tutorial college in every street corner virtually, So my thing will be very small group and one-to-one tutorials. So we're going to not try and pile them high. We're going to give that individual attention that you get in an Oxford tutorial, and however much it costs. And because we've got all the tutors that are used to doing that, just take them down one level to A level, should be okay. And it worked really well. And so we started, I think we literally started with 6 enrolments on the first year. And then it kind of grew, and really our sector was wealthy families who couldn't get their kids into a big name school, or they'd left it too late. Right, the lead time, some of these big name schools are like years, certainly a year, So, but there we were, and we had all these incredible Oxford academics on our teacher role, and so these families had some bragging rights, and that's what they were looking for. They couldn't get into Eton or Harrow, but it's Oxford International. Look, all their teachers are Oxbridge. So to cut to the chase, that was 90. When did I start? 2002, we sat in an office. 2003, the first kids came, and in 2019, I sold it.
Just make sure, the final product, that was a full-time school then?
Full-time, A-level tutorial, A-levels, but we also moved down to GCSE by that. The reason being, A-levels is a 2-year course.
Yes.
My core business had a 50% churn rate, because every year, you've got to replace 50%. It's a really tough market, and it's the cost of acquisition for a pupil at £50,000 a year. I think my school fees now, my school's still going, is probably 60 grand a year now.
Right.
The reason for that is we were the #1 ranked A-level school in the world. 93% of students got A stars or A's at A-level. 100% of our med school applicants got into med school. Every single, if you get into my school, your child will go to med school. Everyone. And so, and that wasn't done with polishing and tutoring. It was done by the real deal. Because at med school, as you'll all know, you can't fake that. You have to really be the real package, because they drill you. You can't just pass exams. So we were accused of being an exam factory, but actually we really worked them hard, and we went into much deeper things than just academics. We went into lots of other things that you'd want to see in your undergraduates. So pretty much that gilt edge guarantee that we're going to get into a top 5 university or med school, so we could charge what we wanted, and it was quite small still, But in the meantime, before I sold it, we'd spun off lots of foreign sites.
Oh.
There were schools in China, Hong Kong, Switzerland, running my brand. So it was a nice little thing that I ended up selling, and I sold a little group actually with the Oxford International College as the flagship, but had all these other, it was a very lean business. It still had that first business that I set up from a mobile phone and a bicycle. It's called Oxford Science Studies. It's still running. It turns over £1 million, and it's still running as one of the little hubs.
So there are 2 things I think was really interesting. One is, as you grow, you go from doing it yourself with your mates to becoming an employer. That's quite often a very difficult thing to go. I remember when I was self-employed, I was looking to take on my first person, and the phone calls you have with HMRC and making sure, incredibly difficult, and it actually in fact put me off. The second one was your first bid to go overseas. So could you just talk about those 2 things, as it were? You're becoming an employer. How did you cope with that, going from being a sole trader or whatever you were effectively, or self-employed, to being an employer? And the second one was about your first overseas, either acquisition or market entry.
Yeah, well, the first question is, how did I go from being a sole trader in the short courses into it? As soon as we registered the school, that was immediately an incorporated company. Incidentally, all of my companies were not-for-profit, which meant that everyone got really well paid, but there was no one walking off, there was no shareholders. So we incorporated the company, and everyone was on the payroll. So that, and you're absolutely right, probably in my whole career, the most challenging aspect is people. Not in a bad way. I mean, I really love working with people. I wouldn't want to go to work without people. However, it's the singularly greatest challenge, working. And as your employee body grows, it gets more and more difficult. Yeah. So, and then the second question is around international. Yeah. So how do we do that?
Where was your first international site?
Yeah, so that was in Shanghai. It was actually in Guangzhou, which was Qingdao, which for those of you who remember was where the Olympic sailing events was when in the Beijing Olympics. And again, there was no strategy around that. There was no plan. What it was a friend of mine. He had an old Etonian. He'd gone to Manchester University, and he'd ended up in China quite early on, before everyone was out there. And he had set himself up as for want of something better to do, counselling the Chinese into how to get into British boarding schools when there was no professional service. After a few years of this, he came to me and said, I want to open a school in China. And he was a customer of Edward Green, the old guy, and he'd gone first to Edward Green, who was still in business. He said, Edward, I want to run your brand in China because it's the one that I really valued. And Edward Green, bless his heart, said, you need to talk to Mario, not me. I'm too old for this. So who's Mario? Well, he set up his own little school, go and talk to Mario. So William came to talk to me and said, I want to run a school in China. I went, fine, what do you need? I just need your brand and some expertise. So he started rolling out schools. And then other partners approached me, because once you've done it once, you can show you can, then you're off to the races, right?
And then what was the relationship? Because one of the things when you look at foreign direct investment or market entry, there are various modes. Was it a franchising model?
Purely licensing model.
And had you any experience? How did you learn how to be the licensor, as it were?
Brilliant question. I mean, I was totally naive in business and finance. Unlike William, the chap, named Jack, he's a really good friend of mine. In fact, right now my son is doing business with him. William Van Bergen, the best guy you'll ever meet to do business with. And he, unlike me, did go to business school. So I relied entirely on the person on the other side of the table to drive the deal, okay? Whatever you say. And in a way, that is the way I operate. It's like, if you want to rip me off, fine. Yeah. So I'm a happy fool, and I probably have been exploited. But on the whole, it's a strategy I would stick with. So really, I find myself often negotiating for the person. I say, I can't see this deal working for you in 5 years. I think we need to, and I did that with William, actually. So the two of us being kind of friends, I relied on his expertise to really, engineer all the financials and all the. I didn't know a licensing deal from a royalty from anything. He said, this is how I want to do it. And so he paid me a royalty for the brand, and then some services that we provided, like how you get good grades and all that sort of thing.
So I'm about to throw it open to the audience, but I think probably one of the other questions we'd like to think about is, you've sold your first business. What do you do next?
That's a really good question. Well,
and you're not particularly materialistic, so you're not going to spend it on lots of yachts and cars in the garage or whatever. So is it about your life next, or is it about, actually, I want to do this again? I've got the bug now.
I was really tired by this 2019. I was so lucky and charmed all the way through, because I had a bit of a feeding frenzy to buy my business. I don't know if you knew this. I certainly wouldn't have known this. But private equity, they hunt in packs. They're all after the same targets. And if one moves, none of them are entrepreneurs. They're all just finance. So private equity, they don't know what they're talking about. They're good at making money, but they need entrepreneurs to create value. So private equity, they hunt in packs, and there are 4 big players in my sector that were trying to take out any existing private school owners. And I was I was a number 1 ranked school. We had international, so I had 4 big groups come after us. And, eventually they just kept bidding it up, and it was a fascinating story, some of which I tell Nigel's students on the BBE course, how the process of exiting and selling your business is a fascinating journey. But at the end of the day, what we ended up doing was, selling for an amount of money, and then it was a question of, what do I do now? Because on paper now, you've got what every human on the planet thinks that you want. You've got time, money, opportunity, a degree of connectivity and status that can open doors. What do you do with that? And I was quite young, 50-something. And the ground truth was, my wife would say I started working harder. And she's annoyed about it. I was about to say, she wasn't happy about it. Because, as you say, I wasn't driven. I really thought of that. And all my friends were like, buy a helicopter. And I have some friends in California that, have helicopters. And go, well, I've been up in here, and, I'm not that bothered. So this point that we talk about, we talked earlier about adapting, the risk But there's a thing called hedonic adaptation, which is really useful to know about. And you probably all heard the principle. But it's the principle that your baseline happiness reverts to a kind of median, no matter what happens. So you can win the lottery and it tracks that down. The important thing is you can have very, very difficult adverse experiences and it'll come back up. Just know that it will. You know, however deep and however bad you feel today, it will get better. But the flip side is you buy a car, you buy a yacht. And the thing is, I have enjoyed those things. I love sailing. I've been sailing all my life. I've never owned a boat. And there wasn't a tiny moment where I thought I'd buy a boat. All my friends say, now's the time you're going to buy a yacht. I went, why do I want to buy a yacht? You've all got them. I'll sell yours. I don't. So in a way, nothing changed. I didn't even buy a new car. I've got an old car. You've seen it. It's all scratched up. I don't care. And that's one of the assets I've been born with. And we talked about loss aversion earlier on. It's like if you don't really attach to these things, it's a superpower, actually. It really is. Now, you can work on that with meditation and so on, or you can just realise that gaining lots of material wealth and status just won't make you happy. Now, it will. You have to get above a certain point. We all know this. And that point is probably, it realistically is about 50 grand. You know, 50 grand a year. Now, there are some marginal gains beyond that, but not much. You look at Richard Layard from the London School of Economics, done tons of work on this. There's a thing called the Easterlin curve, if you want to look at it, and it plots this in nations. And it is really good to know this stuff, because if you're a single individual and you're in a situation, a life situation, it's good to know, it's good to be informed before you make a hell of a lot of mistakes. And I was really interested in happiness. I've met Anthony Selden, Action for Happiness, Richard Laird from Anthony Selden, former Vice Chancellor of this university. And he was a real mentor to me, actually, around happiness. And he started getting me interested in the science of happiness. Very interesting, worth understanding. Because after all, you all want to be happy. Well, an intelligent person like you ought to know what that involves. So I was really intrigued. And so I thought, I'm not interested. I know what it's like, and you all know what it's like. You buy a new car or something. How long does that last?
Exactly.
You know, and how long does anything last?
Exactly. Adaptation thing. You know, people might, you know, I play in bands, I play guitars, and I've got friends who've got lots of guitars. And I think, I love trying that guitar, but actually, once I've got it, it doesn't give you the endless joy that you thought to give you. It's and you've got used to it, and actually you could have been just as happy with that as well. But can I end by thanking?
And before you do that, can you indulge me 1 more second?
Yeah, please.
And that is.
Well, you sent me that, didn't you?
The whole thing has been a real indulgence for me, so I'm really grateful to. But I just want to demonstrate that scientists aren't all Philistine, and this is just something that really touches my heart, and it maybe speaks to some of the questions tonight. I'm just going to read it out, just 4 verses of a poem called The Man in the Glass, with apologies to kind of the gender specificity about that, but you can all filter man for woman, but I'm going to read it as it was written, right, by a chap called Peter Wimbrow. When you get what you want in your struggle for self, and the world makes you king for a day, just go to the mirror and look at yourself and see what that man has to say. For it isn't your father or mother or wife whose judgment upon you must pass. The fellow whose verdict counts most in your life is the one staring back from the glass. He's the fellow to please. Never mind all the rest, for he's with you clear to the end. And you've passed your most difficult, dangerous test if the man in the glass is your friend. You may fool the whole world down the pathway of years and get pats on the back as you pass, but your final reward will be heartache and tears if you've cheated the man in the glass.